Harper Calloway held the broken joystick like a prayer, its shattered plastic edges cutting into her palm. 18 months later. She still carried that piece of her destroyed wheelchair, not as a reminder of what they took from her, but as proof of what they couldn't break. The cafeteria at Westfield High stretched before her like a battlefield mapped by invisible lines. 500 students, 96% white, scattered across tables that might as well have had velvet ropes around them. The popular kids claimed the windows where November light made their privilege glow like halos. The scholarship kids, all 12 of them, hugged the walls like shadows trying not to be seen. Harper navigated her current wheelchair, a basic insurance model that squeaked with every turn. Through the maze of designer backpacks and judgmental stares, she was used to being watched. At Westfield, being one of 12 black faces among 2,000 meant you were always performing, always being evaluated, always carrying the weight of representation on 17-year-old shoulders. But today felt different. Today felt like the air before a storm. She'd been at Westfield for 3 years on a full academic scholarship, back when she could walk, back when her biggest problem was code switching between her neighborhood voice and her school voice, back when her dreams reached as high as Broadway stages and Lincoln Center spotlights. Before the collapse. The memory hit her the way it always did, sudden and sharp as breaking glass. The East Side Community Theater, the stage her mother had helped fundraise for, the stage that was supposed to bring arts education to kids who looked like her. She'd been rehearsing Lady Macbeth, 17 years old, and convinced she was invincible. "Out, damned spot," she'd whispered to herself that night, practicing in the wings. She'd had no idea she was about to become the spot that couldn't be scrubbed clean from Westfield's pristine reputation. The stage had groaned first, a sound like bones breaking. Then the world tilted sideways. 2x4s and steel beams, cheap materials that Prescott Construction had used to cut costs, came down like Judgment Day. Harper remembered every detail, the taste of sawdust in her mouth, the weight of a beam across her spine, the way the emergency lights cast everything in hellish red. Most of all, she remembered the voices. Control the narrative. David Prescott had told someone on his phone, standing just close enough to the ambulance that she could hear. These people always find something to complain about anyway. These people. The man whose company logo was on every building at Westfield, whose name was carved in marble above the library entrance, had looked at her broken body and seen nothing but a liability to be managed. Now, 18 months later, his son was walking toward her table. Ethan Prescott moved through the cafeteria like he owned it. Because, in many ways, he did. 6 feet tall lacrosse captain, early admission to Stanford already locked up. His blonde hair caught the light the same way his father's did in newspaper photos, and he carried himself with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about belonging anywhere. Behind him came his usual crew. Madison Phillips, whose great-grandfather had owned half of Colorado Springs before selling it to become what people politely called old money. Jake Morrison, whose family ran the city's largest law firm. Connor Walsh, whose dad was the police chief. And bringing up the rear, Autumn Chen, the only non-white face in their group. Token Asian, Harper thought. Just diverse enough to let them claim they weren't completely homogeneous. Autumn's presence always made Harper's stomach turn, not because she disliked Autumn, but because she understood her. When you're one of the only faces of color in a sea of white, you learn to make compromises. You learn to laugh at jokes that aren't funny, to stay quiet when you should speak up. to be grateful for acceptance even when it comes with conditions. Harper had made those same compromises her first 2 years at Westfield. Before the accident changed everything. "Harper Calloway," Ethan said, stopping at her table. His voice carried that particular tone she'd learned to recognize, the one that sounded friendly on the surface but carried undertones of ownership. "Mind if we sit?" It wasn't really a question. They were already arranging themselves around her table, boxing her in with practiced ease. "Free country," Harper said, her voice steady. She'd learned not to show fear, even when her heart was racing. "Is it, though?" Madison asked, settling into her chair with the fluid grace of someone who'd taken ballet for 12 years. "Sometimes I wonder." The comment hung in the air like smoke. Madison had a talent for saying things that sounded innocent to anyone listening, but carried a different message entirely for their intended target. "So," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair with studied casualness. "Big day tomorrow." Tomorrow. The day she'd been dreading and anticipating for 18 months. Tomorrow, David Prescott would sit in a courtroom and explain to a jury why his company's cost-cutting measures had left a 17-year-old girl paralyzed. Tomorrow, she would have to relive the worst night of her life in front of strangers. "Yeah," Harper said simply. "Must be nerve-wracking," Jake added. His voice carried the particular smugness of someone whose family had enough lawyers to bury any problem. "All those questions, all that pressure, all those people watching you." And the implied threat was subtle but clear. "We're watching you. Your people are so strong, though," Madison said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "So resilient. Look at everything your ancestors survived." There it was, the microaggression wrapped in a compliment, the reminder that Harper would always be seen first as a representative of her race, rather than as an individual. Your people. As if Harper was responsible for carrying the strength of every black person who'd ever lived. "Must run in the family," Ethan said. "I saw that video of your brother. Pretty intense stuff." Harper's blood went cold. Connor was supposed to be deployed overseas. She hadn't seen him in 8 months, hadn't even been able to reach him by phone. "What video?" Ethan pulled out his phone, swiped to YouTube, and turned the screen toward her. The video showed a man in military fatigues, sitting in what looked like a hospital bed. The title read, "Wounded Veteran Talks About Fighting for America While Family Suffers at Home." The man in the video had Connor's face, but something was wrong. His eyes were vacant, his speech slurred. He looked broken in a way that made Harper's chest tight. "He earned his chair," Ethan said softly. "What's your excuse?" The words hit Harper like a physical blow. Around them, conversations continued. Students laughed and gossiped and planned their weekends, completely unaware that psychological warfare was being conducted 3 tables from the lunch line. "You know," Ethan continued, his voice still conversational, "tomorrow's going to be really hard on everyone. My dad's been under so much stress. The whole family has. It's been really difficult, having our name dragged through the mud over what was clearly just a tragic accident." "Accident," Harper repeated. The word tasted bitter. "These things happen," Madison said with a shrug. "Buildings fall down. People get hurt. It's nobody's fault, really." "Of course, some people see opportunity in tragedy," Jake added. "Lawsuits, payouts. Sometimes I think people are just looking for someone to blame when life doesn't go their way." The conversation around them had grown quieter. Other students were starting to notice the way animals sense when predators are circling. But no one was going to intervene. At Westfield, you learned early that getting involved in other people's business was a luxury only certain people could afford, especially when it involved the Prescotts. "The thing is," Ethan said, leaning forward now, his voice dropping to just above a whisper, "tomorrow could go a lot of different ways, depending on what people say, what they remember, how they choose to tell their story." Harper met his eyes directly. "I choose to tell the truth." "Truth is subjective," Madison said, examining her manicure. "Memory is unreliable. Trauma clouds judgment. That's what the defense attorneys will say." "Good lawyers," Jake added. "The best money can buy." The threat was getting less subtle by the minute, but Harper had spent 18 months preparing for this moment. 18 months building her strength back up from zero. She'd learned things about herself in that time, things that surprised her. She'd learned she was harder to break than anyone expected. "You know what I think," Autumn said suddenly. It was the first time she'd spoken since sitting down, and her voice carried a nervous energy that made Harper look at her more closely. "I think," Autumn continued, "that sometimes people get so focused on revenge that they forget about consequences, not just for themselves, but for other people, people they care about." Her eyes flicked meaningfully toward the exit, where a security guard named Marcus Williams was standing. Marcus, who was one of only 3 black employees at Westfield. Marcus, whose daughter attended Harper's old middle school. Marcus, who nodded at Harper every morning and called her little sister when no one was listening. "Jobs are hard to find," Autumn said quietly, "especially for certain people, especially when they have families to feed." The message was crystal clear. Keep pushing, and other people will pay the price. But Harper had learned something else in her 18 months of recovery, something that surprised everyone, including herself. She'd learned that some fights were worth having, even when you knew they'd cost you everything. "You know what I think," Harper said, her voice carrying clearly enough that nearby tables started turning to listen. "I think some people confuse power with protection. They think having money means having immunity. They think being connected means being untouchable." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Careful, Harper." "But here's the thing about truth," Harper continued, rolling her wheelchair back slightly to give herself room. "It doesn't care about your last name. It doesn't care about your bank account. It doesn't care about who your daddy knows." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a folder, thick with documents, medical records, engineering reports, communication logs between Prescott Construction and the city planning office. "Truth just is," she said, setting the folder on the table. "And tomorrow, a jury is going to hear a lot of it." The temperature at the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ethan's casual mask was slipping, revealing something harder underneath. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "No idea how deep this goes, how many people you're going to hurt. If you're feeling that rush of what's going to happen next, hit that like button. It really helps more people discover these stories. And if you want to share where you're watching from, drop it in the comments below. For those who want to support more stories like this one, there's a thanks button right under this video. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps me bring you more inspiring tales of courage and standing up for what's right. Thank you for being here. Now, let's see what happens when push comes to shove. Starting with yourself, Madison added. Did you know your mom's been picking up extra shifts at St. Mary's? Working the overnight emergency room. Dangerous neighborhood. That. All kinds of things can happen to someone walking to their car at 3 in the morning. Harper's blood turned to ice. Her mother, Loretta Calloway, was the strongest person she knew. A nurse who'd put herself through school while raising 2 kids, who'd worked double shifts to pay for Harper's theater classes, who'd held Harper's hand through every surgery and never once made her feel like a burden. The threat against her mother crossed a line that Harper hadn't even known existed. "You want to be very careful about what you just said," Harper said, her voice deadly quiet. "I'm just making an observation," Madison replied with artificial innocence. "Crime statistics, demographics. You know how these things work." Ethan reached into his backpack and pulled out something that made Harper's breath catch. A hammer. Not a tool belt hammer, but a sledgehammer. Scaled down but still substantial. The kind of thing that could do serious damage. "You know," he said, hefting the hammer like he was testing its weight. "I've been thinking about your chair. Must have cost a fortune. Insurance covers stuff like that." "Right. After accidents." "What are you doing?" Autumn asked, her voice sharp with sudden fear. "Just having a conversation," Ethan said, but his eyes were fixed on Harper's wheelchair, and there was something in his expression that made the hair on her arms stand up. "This is a nice one," he continued, running his free hand along the arm of Harper's chair. "All the electronic controls. Must make you feel pretty independent. Pretty powerful." Harper realized what was about to happen a split second before it did. She tried to roll backwards, but Jake and Connor had positioned themselves behind her, blocking her escape. "The thing about power," Ethan said, standing up slowly, "is that it can be taken away." He raised the hammer. "Ethan, no!" Autumn jumped to her feet, but Madison grabbed her arm, holding her back. "This is insane," Autumn protested. "You can't just what?" Ethan asked, his voice eerily calm. "Can't defend my family. Can't protect our reputation. Can't make sure justice gets served." He brought the hammer down on the joystick panel of Harper's wheelchair with a sound like breaking bones. The cafeteria exploded into chaos. Students screamed, chairs scraped against the floor as people jumped up or scrambled away. Someone was shouting for security. Someone else was crying. But Harper didn't move. She sat perfectly still as Ethan raised the hammer again, as he brought it down on the armrest, as plastic and metal and $8,000 worth of medical equipment shattered around her. "This is what happens," Ethan said between swings, "when people don't know their place. Crash. This is what happens when you forget who runs things around here. Crash. This is what happens when you think you can take down people better than you." The wheelchair's electronics sparked and died. The motor made a grinding sound and went silent. Harper was now trapped in a prison of broken plastic and twisted metal, completely immobile. Students were pulling out phones, filming, but Harper noticed that most of them were recording Ethan, not her. Even in her destruction, she wasn't the story. She was just the prop in someone else's drama. "Your people should be grateful," Ethan said, breathing hard from the exertion. "Grateful for the opportunities you've been given. Grateful that people like my family even care enough to help communities like yours." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. Cash. More cash than Harper had seen in one place in her entire life. $5,000, he said, dropping it onto the wreckage of her wheelchair. "That's more than your mama makes in 2 months. Take it. Your people know about making deals. Right?" The racist undertone wasn't even subtle anymore, but Harper still didn't speak. She was waiting. "Cat got your tongue?" Madison asked, her voice dripping with mock concern. "It's a good offer. Probably the best one you're going to get." "Of course," Jake added. "If you don't want to be reasonable, things could get much more complicated. For everyone." "St. Mary's is struggling financially," Connor Walsh said, speaking for the first time. Budget cuts, staff reductions. They might have to close their East Side clinic. Where would all those people go? The threat was crystal clear. Accept the money, drop the lawsuit, or watch your community suffer. Harper looked around the cafeteria. 500 students, and not one of them was moving to help her. The security guard, Marcus, was notably absent. Even the teachers who should have been monitoring lunch periods seemed to have vanished. This wasn't random. This was planned. What's it going to be, Harper? Ethan asked. Easy way or hard way? Harper reached down and picked up the broken joystick from her destroyed wheelchair. The plastic was sharp where it had snapped, and a thin line of blood appeared on her palm where she gripped it. You know what the difference is between you and me, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent cafeteria. You think power comes from taking things away from people. I know it comes from refusing to be broken. Ethan's face went red. You stupid! He was interrupted by the sound of Harper's phone ringing, in the dead silence of the cafeteria. The electronic chirp was as loud as a gunshot. Harper looked at the caller ID and smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. FBI, she said, showing the screen to everyone at the table. I should probably take this. The color drained from Ethan's face so fast, Harper thought he might faint. Agent Chen, Harper said, putting the phone on speaker. Perfect timing. Harper, came a woman's voice, crisp and professional. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. Actually, Harper said, looking directly at Ethan, I think you're calling at exactly the right time. Good. We have some news about your case, about the Prescott investigation. The cafeteria was so quiet you could hear individual heartbeats. The investigation is broader than we initially discussed. Agent Chen continued. We've been looking into Prescott construction for the past 18 months. And what we've found goes far beyond your theater incident. Ethan started to back away from the table, but Harper's voice stopped him. Agent Chen, could you put me on speaker? I think there are some people here who would be very interested in what you have to say. Of course, Harper. We've discovered a pattern of deliberately substandard construction in minority communities throughout Colorado. Denver's Five Points neighborhood, Pueblo's Bessemer district, Colorado Springs' East Side, all historically black and Latino areas, all built with materials that didn't meet code. The silence in the cafeteria was deafening. We believe this was intentional, Agent Chen continued. A systematic effort to devalue properties in these neighborhoods as part of a larger gentrification scheme. We have recorded conversations between David Prescott and several city officials discussing what they called urban renewal through strategic development failures. Harper watched the blood drain from not just Ethan's face, but from Madison's, Jake's, and Connor's as well. Their families were all connected to the Prescotts, all part of the same network. Agent Chen, Harper said, still maintaining eye contact with Ethan. When you say recorded conversations, what exactly do you mean, wiretaps, Harper? We've been monitoring Prescott communications for over a year. We have everything. The bribery, the code violations, the deliberate targeting of minority communities. Tomorrow's trial is just the beginning. Ethan's hand went to his pocket, probably reaching for his phone to call his father, but Harper wasn't done. Agent Chen, one more question. When you say everything, does that include threats made against potential witnesses? Absolutely. Any intimidation of witnesses is a federal crime. We take that very seriously. Harper looked around the cafeteria, at the hundreds of students who had just witnessed Ethan's attack on her wheelchair, at the phones that had recorded every word of the threats against her mother. In that case, Harper said, I think you might want to check social media in about 10 minutes. I have a feeling there's going to be some very interesting video evidence. She could already see students uploading videos, typing frantically on their phones. The story was spreading in real time. Rich boy destroys disabled girl's wheelchair. Prescott's son threatens lawsuit victim. FBI investigating construction company. Within hours, it would be national news. Ethan looked around the cafeteria as if seeing it for the first time. 500 witnesses, dozens of cameras, a federal agent on speakerphone confirming an FBI investigation. His privileged world was crumbling in real time. "This isn't over," he said. But his voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "You're right," Harper agreed. "It's just beginning." As if summoned by some invisible signal, security guards appeared at the cafeteria entrances, not just Marcus, who Harper now realized had been strategically absent during the attack, but 6 officers in dark uniforms, federal agents. "Ethan Prescott," Agent Chen's voice came through the phone. "You need to remain exactly where you are. We have some questions for you." The cafeteria erupted into chaos as agents moved through the crowd, but Harper sat perfectly still in her destroyed wheelchair, still holding the broken joystick, still bleeding from her palm. She thought about the 18 months since the accident, the 43 surgeries, the physical therapy that felt like torture, the nights she'd cried herself to sleep, mourning not just her legs, but her dreams of Broadway, her sense of safety, her faith in justice. She thought about all the times she'd been told to be grateful, to know her place, to understand that some people were just more important than others, but mostly. She thought about her mother, working double shifts to pay for medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. About her brother Connor, wherever he was, fighting for a country that didn't always fight back for people like them. About every black and brown kid who'd been told they didn't belong, didn't matter, didn't deserve justice. Tomorrow, David Prescott would sit in a courtroom and face a jury. But today, his son had just handed them everything they needed to win. Harper looked down at the broken joystick in her bloody palm. 18 months ago, she'd thought it represented everything she'd lost. Now she realized it represented everything she'd found. The strength to refuse to be broken. The courage to speak truth to power. The faith that justice, delayed, was not justice denied. As the FBI agents handcuffed Ethan Prescott in front of 500 of his classmates, Harper Calloway smiled. The broken girl they'd tried to silence had just brought down an empire. 2 weeks later, Harper sat in the same cafeteria. But everything had changed. The table where Ethan Prescott had destroyed her wheelchair was now occupied by freshmen who had no idea they were eating lunch on a battlefield. The viral videos had died down. The news crews had moved on to other stories. Westfield High had returned to its carefully maintained illusion of normalcy. But Harper knew better. She'd spent 14 days playing the role of the defeated victim, letting everyone think Ethan's arrest had broken her spirit. She'd kept her head down, accepted condolences with quiet grace, and let the Prescott legal team believe they'd succeeded in intimidating her into submission. She was very good at acting. After all, she'd been preparing for Broadway before her world fell apart. The new wheelchair provided by the school district was even more basic than her insurance model. No electronics, manual operation only. The kind of thing that screamed charity case to anyone who looked. Harper pushed herself slowly across the cafeteria, letting her shoulders slump with practiced defeat. She had an audience. She always had an audience at Westfield. What most people didn't know was that her real audience was much larger than they imagined. The earpiece was so small it was invisible, tucked deep in her ear canal. The wire was thinner than a human hair, running down her collar to a device no bigger than a quarter taped between her shoulder blades. For 2 weeks, she'd been wearing federal surveillance equipment, documenting every conversation, every threat, every casual act of racism that the Prescott network thought was safe to express. "Harper," came Agent Chen's voice in her ear, barely a whisper. "Target approaching from your left." David Prescott himself was walking toward her table, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits. The king had come to personally ensure his kingdom remained intact. Harper had seen David Prescott on television, in newspapers, at city council meetings where he'd presented his vision for Colorado Springs' future. But seeing him in person was different. He moved like a man who'd never been told no, never been denied anything he wanted, never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. Until now. "Miss Calloway," he said, settling into the chair across from her without being invited. His voice was warm, grandfatherly, the kind of tone that had convinced voters to elect him to the school board twice. "I hope you don't mind if I join you." "Free country," Harper said, echoing her response to Ethan 2 weeks earlier. "Is it?" Though, David Prescott asked, and Harper heard the same entitled tone his son had inherited. "Sometimes I wonder if we really understand what freedom means in this country, what it costs. Who pays the price?" The men with him didn't sit. They stood like guards, scanning the cafeteria as if threats might emerge from among the teenagers eating pizza and gossiping about weekend plans. "I understand my son got a little heated with you recently," David continued. "Young men, you know, they feel things so intensely. They see their family being attacked, and they react emotionally." Harper said nothing. The recording device was capturing every word. "But I'm not young," David continued. "I'm old enough to understand that sometimes. The best solution is the practical one, the one that helps everyone involved." He slid a folder across the table, much thicker than the envelope of cash Ethan had offered, much more substantial. "Settlement offer," he said. 7 figures. More money than most people see in a lifetime. Enough to pay for the best medical care money can buy. Enough to secure your future, your family's future. Harper opened the folder. The number was staggering. More money than her mother would make in 20 years of nursing. Enough to buy a house, pay for college, ensure she never had to worry about medical bills again. "All you have to do," David said softly, "is to tell the truth. The truth that accidents happen, that sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts, tragedies occur. That blame doesn't bring back what's lost, but forgiveness and moving forward can build something better." His voice was hypnotic, reasonable. This was how he'd convinced Puripi city planners to approve substandard materials, how he'd persuaded inspectors to look the other way, how he'd built an empire on the graves of other people's dreams. "You know," he continued, "I've been thinking about your mother, Loretta. Isn't it wonderful woman, dedicated nurse, the kind of person who really makes a difference in the world?" Harper's blood went cold. "St. Mary's is lucky to have her," David said. "Of course. Hospitals are struggling these days. Budget cuts, staff reductions. It would be terrible if someone like your mother, someone so committed to serving her community, found herself without a job." The threat was wrapped in concern, coated with false sympathy, but it was unmistakably a threat. "Or take your brother," David continued. Connor, right serving overseas. Hero, the kind of young man who makes America proud. It would be tragic if something happened to affect his military career. Mental health issues, PTSD, sometimes these things just develop. Harper thought about the video Ethan had shown her, Connor looking broken and drugged in what she'd assumed was a hospital bed. Now she understood. They'd gotten to him first. Her brother, the strongest person she knew, had been neutralized before she'd even known there was a war. "The thing is, Harper," David said, leaning forward, "you're not just fighting for yourself anymore. Your choices affect other people. Good people. People who trust you to make the right decision." In her ear, Agent Chen's voice was urgent. "Keep him talking. We need more." "What about the other families?" Harper asked. "The other communities you've destroyed?" David's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold underneath. "I'm sorry. Denver's 5 Points, Pueblo's Bessemer, all those accidents, all those coincidences." "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," David said, but his voice had lost its warmth. "The East Side Project," Harper pressed. "The Urban Renewal Plan." David went completely still. "Who told you about that? Maybe the same people who told me about the wiretaps." The two men flanking David stepped closer to the table. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You're playing a very dangerous game, young lady," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "One you don't understand. One you can't win." "Maybe, but at least I'm not playing alone." David's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" Harper smiled. "It means you should probably look behind you." David turned, and Harper watched his face go white as fresh snow. Connor Calloway was walking across the cafeteria, but not the broken man from the video. This Connor moved with military precision, his shoulders squared, his eyes alert. He wore a dark suit that couldn't quite hide the fact that he was armed. And he wasn't alone. Agent Sarah Chen flanked him on one side, her FBI credentials clearly visible. On the other side walked a woman Harper didn't recognize. Asian American, wearing the kind of severe black suit that suggested serious authority. "David Prescott," Agent Chen said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent cafeteria. "You're under arrest." The cafeteria erupted into chaos. But Harper sat perfectly still as federal agents materialized from what seemed like nowhere. Students screamed and scattered, but the agents moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding not just David, but the two men with him. "This is harassment," David snarled as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "I have lawyers. I have connections. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Actually," Agent Chen said, "we know exactly who we're dealing with. We've been watching you for 18 months. We have recordings of you discussing the deliberate sabotage of minority communities. We have financial records showing bribes to city officials. We have engineering reports proving you knowingly used substandard materials." "That's impossible," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Connor spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen real combat. "Because I've been undercover for over a year, documenting everything, every meeting, every payoff, every racist comment you thought no one was recording." "You see," Agent Chen continued, "what you never understood is that Harper wasn't fighting alone. She was never fighting alone. Every threat you made, every intimidation tactic you used, every time you assumed you could buy or bully your way out of consequences, you were digging your grave deeper. The woman in the severe black suit stepped forward. "Judge Catherine Yang," she said, showing her credentials. "I'll be presiding over an emergency hearing this afternoon to approve search warrants for Prescott Construction, Prescott Development, and 17 properties connected to your urban renewal scheme." David's face went from white to gray. "You can't do this. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent," Agent Chen said. "I suggest you use it." As they led David Prescott away in handcuffs, Harper noticed something that made her heart soar. Students weren't running anymore. They were standing, watching, some of them filming. But unlike 2 weeks ago, when they'd recorded her humiliation, now they were documenting justice. "Harper," Connor said, approaching her table as the chaos settled. "You okay?" She looked at her brother, really looked at him. He was older, harder than when she'd last seen him, marked by whatever he'd had to do to maintain his cover. But his eyes were the same, full of the protective love that had watched over her since they were children. "I'm perfect," she said, and meant it. "We got them all," he said, sitting down beside her. 47 arrests today. City councilmen, building inspectors, police officials, construction supervisors, the whole network. What happens now?" Agent Chen approached their table, pulling out a chair. "Now we rebuild. The federal settlement includes funding for a new community center on the east side, medical facilities, educational programs, and a foundation to prevent this from happening to other communities. The Harper Calloway Foundation," Connor added with a grin. Harper felt tears in her eyes for the first time since the accident. Not tears of pain or frustration, but tears of something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. "There's something else," Agent Chen said. "Johns Hopkins has a new experimental treatment for spinal cord injuries. Stem cell therapy combined with neural regeneration techniques. It's not a guarantee, but the early results are promising." "And Juilliard," Connor added. "Held your place. They want you back when you're ready." Harper looked around the cafeteria, at the students who were slowly returning to their tables, at the broken pieces of her old wheelchair that maintenance still hadn't cleaned up, at the place where she'd learned that sometimes the only way to survive a war is to fight back. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the broken joystick she'd carried for 2 weeks. The sharp plastic had cut her palm that day, but the wound had healed. The scar remained, a thin white line across her lifeline. "You know what I realized," she said, looking at the broken piece of her old life. "They tried to break this to break me, but they never understood that being broken doesn't mean being defeated." She set the joystick on the table, right next to the settlement papers that would fund the restoration of her community. "Sometimes," she continued, "broken things are the strongest things of all, because they've already survived the worst, and they're still here." 6 months later, Harper Calloway pushed herself across a different stage. Not the Broadway stage she'd once dreamed of, but the stage at the East Side Community Center, rebuilt with federal settlement money and named in honor of all the families the Prescott Network had tried to destroy. The audience was full of faces that looked like hers, children from the neighborhood who now had a safe place to learn and grow and dream. In the front row sat her mother, who'd been promoted to head nurse at the new East Side Medical Clinic. Beside her, Connor wore his dress blues, his real medals, not the fake broken version the Prescotts had tried to create, and in the back, almost hidden in the shadows, stood Agent Chen and Judge Yang, 2 women who'd proven that justice, delayed, was not justice denied. Harper looked out at the audience and began to speak. 2 years ago, she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the rebuilt theater. I thought my story was about falling down. I thought it was about being broken, being silenced, being told I didn't belong. She paused, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. But I was wrong. My story isn't about falling down. It's about getting back up. It's about refusing to let other people define what you're worth. It's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be invisible. In her pocket, she still carried the broken joystick, not as a reminder of what she'd lost, but as proof of what she'd found. The strength to turn pain into purpose, trauma into triumph, broken pieces into something whole and beautiful and unbreakable. As the audience rose to their feet, applauding not just her words but everything they represented, Harper Calloway smiled. The broken girl had become an unbreakable woman, and this was just the beginning.